Following the Treaty of Velasco, Texas was an independent nation. If you're wondering about that weird shape, that is the area Texas claimed was its territory. Keep that in mind because it comes up again in 1850. And to this day, there are still people that claim that this should be Texas's boundaries. If you ever see a bumper sticker that says Ski Texas, it's because there's some great ski lodges up in the Colorado area. It's fascinating to me that people would actually want this. It's such an ugly shape. I would personally support it just because of how many tattoos would be ruined. I think that's kind of funny, but it's really ugly. As an independent republic, it of course had to create a constitution, which it did. It was a very pro-slavery constitution, legalized slavery, prohibited free blacks from coming in the state at all, and made Sam Houston the first president of the nation, and immediately voted to annex itself to the United States. From the very beginning, the people of Texas wanted to be part of the United States, the vast majority of them. Now, there was a problem. In 1836, obviously, Andrew Jackson is president, and Jackson wanted to annex Texas. But even Jackson, who was notorious for doing whatever he wanted, wasn't able to, for two big reasons. One, both Mexico and Santa Anna said that the treaty was not valid. And so annexing Texas very well might mean war with Mexico. But more importantly, Texas was a slave republic. So it would add another slave state to the United States, and this was a very contentious issue. This is when radical abolitionists were becoming a thing, and anti-slavery in general was becoming a bigger thing. And if you remember the Missouri Compromise, Missouri Controversy and Compromise was about bringing a slave state in, and that had been a very touchy issue. Texas was the even bigger one. And so because it was going to be such a politically divisive issue, and 1836 was an election year, and Andrew Jackson didn't want to hurt the chances of his successor, Martin Van Buren, he did not annex Texas. So Texas will remain an independent nation for 10 years. And to make a very long story short, as an independent nation, Texas was a complete disaster. Texas's 10 years as an independent country was a hot mess, and there's no other way to put it. It was just a disaster. It was incredibly weak militarily. In 1842 alone, the Mexican army comes in and invades and takes San Antonio without a fight and then just leaves. And the Texas government was so weak. Its military was so weak, it had no money, it just couldn't do anything. It had absolutely no money throughout this period, and so it would borrow as much money as it could, but it had a lot of places did not want to lend to it, so it would end up printing up money, but it will run up a debt of $10 million, which the U.S. government runs up in about 5 seconds, but at the time it was a ton of money. So it was a disaster of a decade. Everything came down to fighting between Sam Houston and a guy named Mirabeau Lamar, which you don't have to know, but it was just all about personalities. And it was a mess. So what are Texans' options? Well, they already tried to annex to the United States, and they will keep making overtures, but it's a politically fraught issue. So the other option was to go to England. and ask England for protection. And England really wanted to do this. England will actually start working on trying to get Mexico to recognize Texas as an independent nation and accept it as an independent nation and provide loans and to become close to Texas. England wanted that for two reasons. One, it was dependent on cotton. Again, cotton, the most important natural resource in the world. So it would mean England could get cotton from both the United States and from Texas, which is good for England, but also it would keep the United States from becoming stronger. So England will start getting involved. And when that happened, during the presidency of John Tyler, bring us back to the present. Tyler absolutely did not want England to have any influence in Texas. And so Tyler will work very hard to try to get Texas annexed during his presidency. And in doing so, he will make a massive mistake. The person that will be in charge of working out the treaty, because it has to be a treaty between two nations, the country of Texas and the country of the United States, had to be worked out by the Secretary of State. And because all of Tyler's cabinet had quit, he had to hire on a new Secretary of State, and he will go with Captain Crazy, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, if you remember, had a falling out with Andrew Jackson. And once he had a falling out with Andrew Jackson and had no hope of being president, he went to South Carolina, and he will become the leading defender of the South and of the pro-slavery argument. And I'm not being mean when I say Captain Crazy. Like, his eyes, people at the time described him as like so intense just to look at and be around. He was an intense person. Like John Quincy Adams, not fun. Calhoun had become so irrational about this, about slavery and the South. He will come in 1844 and he'll work out a treaty with Texas. So Calhoun and Texas work out a treaty. And the treaty says that Texas will come into the United States as a territory with statehood down the road, just like every single other territory does. Now, treaties have to be approved by the Senate. So Calhoun works out the treaty, and then he sent it to the Senate. And here's how irrational he had gotten to this point. He sent the treaty to the Senate, and then he had to send a letter explaining to the Senate why they should support the treaty. And there were a lot of people that opposed Texas coming in, abolitionists, people who were anti-slavery. There were pamphlets saying that the whole thing was a slave conspiracy. And Democrats kept saying, like, no, this isn't about slavery. This is about, expanding the United States, making it bigger, make it stronger. Calhoun, in his letter to the Senate, actually said, we need to bring Texas into the nation in order to protect and expand slavery. So he said the exact opposite thing that Democrats were saying. He said the quiet part out loud and completely destroyed any chance of annexation. So his own irrationality and stupidity. He was so pro-slavery by this point that it will die in the Senate. It becomes a North-South issue, and when the Senate votes, all the Whigs, 29 Whigs vote against it, and 1 Whig votes for it. And so it becomes a completely partisan issue. Democrats are a little more divided because there were a lot of Northern Democrats, 15 for, 5 against. You don't have to know the numbers, but just know it became a sectional issue between the North and the South, and annexation will fail. And it's because of Calhoun's ridiculousness. So Texas in 1844 was, the treaty to bring it in was rejected. And this set the backdrop for the election of 1844. Same year was an election year. And going into the election, it was assumed by everyone that the Whigs were going to nominate Henry Clay again. This will be his third time to... Whigs have such a bad track record of candidates. They were going to go with Henry Clay again for the third time. Democrats were... everyone assumed they were going to go with Martin Van Buren. Now, when the Annexation Treaty went to the Senate, both Clay and Van Buren agreed, not even with each other, but they both came to the same conclusion about Texas, and they opposed annexation for fear of war with Mexico and possibly a civil war in the United States. So both Van Buren and Clay made it clear they did not support annexation of Texas. Now, this was a problem because the majority of Americans did support annexation of Texas. The majority of Americans supported annexing Texas into the Union. So the leaders of the parties are trying to avoid this issue because it's super contentious, but they're going against the will of the common man. Again, the Jacksonian era is known for the will of the common man, and the common man overwhelmingly, it wasn't overwhelming, but a lot of Americans supported annexation of Texas. And that will become very clear in the election. Clay will get the nomination as expected, but when Clay got the nomination, the Whig platform didn't even mention Texas at all. When the Democrats held their convention, Martin Van Buren could not get the party's nomination because of his stance on Texas. People in his party really wanted Texas, and he was not with them. He was a Northern Democrat from New York, and so he lost the support of all Southern Democrats, including Andrew Jackson. Remember, Andrew Jackson, he had been Andrew Jackson's right-hand man, but Andrew Jackson even abandoned him over the issue of Texas annexation. So there will be several votes, and they cannot pick a candidate until Andrew Jackson himself recommends they look at another candidate, a guy named James K. Polk. And Jackson will recommend Polk. James K. Polk was from Tennessee, and this is why this period is also part of the Jacksonian era, because Jackson is still pulling the strings. Not only that, James K. Polk's nickname was Young Hickory. If you remember, Andrew Jackson's nickname is Old Hickory. Polk's nickname is Young Hickory because he worshipped Jackson, and worship is not an exaggeration. Polk's wife, bit of an oversimplification, but the way Polk decided on his wife is he asked Jackson, who should I marry? And Jackson's like, her. And so that was he's like, okay. He just worshipped him. So his nickname was Young Hickory. And really importantly, he was an all-out expansionist. That's one of the most important things James K. Polk cared about is expansion. And with Jackson's support, he will win the Democratic nomination. So Jackson puts his support behind Polk. Polk wins the nomination. And side note, he is the first dark horse candidate, or a candidate that comes out of nowhere that no one knew anything about and just takes the nomination. So he will become the Democratic candidate, and the Democratic Party's platform is all-out territorial expansion. They will specifically talk about the annexation of Texas and Oregon, which we'll talk about in a minute. That was another issue. But they were offering expansion, and not just expansion in the South with Texas. They're also talking about expansion in the North. So while they specifically talked about Texas and Oregon, overall, their clear issue was they were the party that's for expansion. When Polk won the nomination, this is an election that had a clear-cut issue between the two parties, expansion versus not expansion, and Polk will win. Now, it was insanely close. It was an insanely close election. You definitely don't have to know this, but ironically enough, Clay probably would have won. There's a good chance he would have won if it hadn't been for a third party called the Liberty Party. It was all about anti-slavery. Henry Clay wasn't anti-slavery enough, so a third party came about, and it will very well could cost him the election, which will lead to the election of James K. Polk, who was very pro-slavery. So third parties, they mess things up sometimes. So the anti-slavery movement will shoot itself in the foot with this one. This is what you call a mandate. This is the American people. It wasn't a huge mandate, but the American people have spoken. The party that is for expansion won the election. And so Americans want expansion. That's how all of this can be seen as democracy in action. Everything that the annexation of Texas, Oregon, and the Mexican cession. Not a huge mandate. There's a lot of Americans that opposed it, but it's still a mandate. Now, when Polk won the election, Tyler still has a few months. Remember, the election's held in November, and at this time, the president's inaugurated in March. So Tyler had a few months, and he really wanted to annex Texas, so he had something of a legacy. So in his final months in office, Tyler will work out a workaround for the treaty. In his final months in office, he worked out a workaround. And instead of bringing Texas in as a territory with the treaty, he will work out annexation by what's called a joint resolution. Joint resolution means it's voted on by both houses of Congress. The House and the Senate will both vote, and it only requires a simple majority. Treaties require 2/3 of the Senate. Joint resolutions only require a simple majority by each house. And you don't have to know those details, but just it's important. It's really important because it changed the way Texas joined the Union. And this is super important because instead of Texas coming in as a territory, it will come in directly as a state, with the caveat that it comes in as a state and it has to keep its debt. So it had $10 million of debt, and it would keep that. Keep that in mind because it comes up again later. But it also gets to keep its public lands. Texas is the only state in the Union that was its own country for a while. California was for like a minute. For its own country for a period of time. It's the only state that came in and got to keep its public lands, and this is so important for the future of Texas. Because Texas, as it turns out, has a ton of oil under its land. Part of the reason to this day Texas is able to have such low tax rates is because it got to keep its land, and there's a lot of oil under the land. There's so many important economic implications of this that we don't have time to go into, but it's one of the reasons Alaska and Texas have such low tax rates is because of how much oil they have. So Texas will come into the Union. Tyler will sign the resolution March 1845, right before he leaves office. It's the very last thing he does. After this, it went to Texas, and now Texans have to vote on it. So first, it will go to the Texas Congress, and the Texas Congress votes unanimously for annexation, save one vote. So that is how much Texans wanted to be part of the United States. Unanimously save one vote. Fun side note, that one vote against annexation was a guy named Richard Bach. He's the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And he said, as a quote, "I promised myself when I came to Texas, I would never live in the same country as that B-word ex-wife of mine, and I don't intend to." So, Franklin humor. So it passed overwhelmingly in Congress, and then it went to the people. Every county got to vote on it, and the people of Texas overwhelmingly voted for annexation. So Tyler, in his last act, will have the mechanism set for bringing Texas into the Union. And that is arguably the most important thing he did as president.